Hey everyone, Dr. Peace here. So glad you could join me. Today we're going to tackle one of the most famous and one of the most controversial classroom exercises ever. It's an experiment that tried to answer a really uncomfortable question. So let's just start with that question. Not what discrimination is on paper, but what it feels like. In your gut. How do you teach that, especially to people who've never had to live it? Well, one teacher thought she'd figured out a way. Okay, so picture this. It's 1968, and a third-grade teacher named Jane Elliott decides she's not going to give a lecture. No, she's going to create an experience, an unforgettable lesson that we now know as the blue eyes/brown eyes exercise. So how did this whole thing actually work? Well, it was deceptively simple, really. Just 4 steps. First, she splits her all-white class into 2 groups based on something totally arbitrary, their eye color. Then, step 2, she assigns status. One group is suddenly superior and the other is inferior. The inferior kids had to wear these collars, they were criticized constantly and kept separate. But here's the kicker, the most powerful part. The very next day, she flipped the whole thing on its head and reversed the roles. And the results? Wow, they were immediate and honestly pretty shocking. Jane Elliott herself said it all right here. She watched her wonderful, sweet kids turn into, well, something else entirely. And it only took 15 minutes. That just goes to show you how powerful a little bit of authority and arbitrary division can be. But you have to wonder, right? Why would any teacher put her students through something like this? Well, this wasn't some random idea she cooked up. It was born out of a moment of incredible national pain. The whole thing kicked off on April 5th, 1968, and that date is so important because it was the day right after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Her students were confused. They couldn't understand why someone would kill him. Elliott realized that just talking about it wasn't going to cut it. She had to show them. And as you can see, the story blew up, going from her local paper all the way to The Tonight Show, which just unleashed this massive wave of both praise and, you guessed it, criticism. And that controversy, it hit really close to home. Back in her small town in Iowa, people were furious. Her own colleagues wouldn't speak to her, her kids were picked on, her family was basically shunned. She became famous, for sure, but in her own community, she was an outcast. So for years and years, the story of this exercise was all we had, these powerful anecdotes. But you know me, I want to know, what does the data say? Does this thing actually work? Can you measure a reduction in prejudice? Eventually, researchers decided it was time to find out. And that's where this comes in. Finally, in 2003, a major study was published in the Journal of Applied Social Psychology. This was huge. It was the first time someone really tried to measure the effects of Jane Elliott's full-day exercise on adults, scientifically. This was a chance to go from just stories to actual science. All right, so let's get into the methods, because this is super important. How did they actually test this? Well, they took a bunch of college students and randomly split them into 2 groups. One group, the exercise group, did the whole 8-hour blue eyes/brown eyes thing with Jane Elliott herself. The other group, the comparison group, just sat through a standard lecture about prejudice. It's a classic setup to answer the question, does this intense emotional experience do more than just a typical presentation? Okay, so to figure out if it worked, they needed a way to measure prejudice, right? One of the main tools they used is something called the social distance scale. It sounds complicated, but the idea is actually pretty simple. It basically asks how comfortable you'd be having different kinds of relationships, like a neighbor, a coworker, a friend, with people from different racial and ethnic groups. All right, the stage is set. We've got the setup, we've got the measurement tools. So, the million-dollar question, did it work? Did this intense, emotional exercise actually make a real difference in people's attitudes? Well, the data came back with a pretty clear yes, but it's complicated. Take a look at this chart. The key takeaway is that the white students who went through the exercise showed much more positive attitudes towards minority groups compared to the students who just got the lecture. So yes, it seems the experience really did change some minds. And it's not just about the numbers. I mean, listen to what one of the participants said. She talks about this few hours of hurt being totally worth it for what she learned. That's a really powerful personal takeaway. And get this. When they asked the white participants if they were glad they went through it, even with how difficult it was, a whopping 9 out of 10 said yes. They saw the value in it for themselves. But here's where it gets really interesting. So 9 out of 10 were glad they did it, but when asked if they'd recommend it to someone else, Only about half of them would. Think about that for a second. It was good for me, but I'm not so sure it would be good for you. That contradiction is everything. And that contradiction right there, it leads us straight into the thorniest part of this whole story, the ethics of it all. The exercise seems to work, on some level. But we have to ask, at what cost? It really all boils down to this one massive question, doesn't it? When you're trying to teach something as important as empathy and fighting prejudice, do the ends justify the means? And critics have a lot to say, for good reason. I mean, let's just run through the big concerns. There's the potential for real psychological harm, humiliation, anxiety. There are huge questions about informed consent. Can you really agree to something like this if you don't know how it's going to feel? Some say it wildly oversimplifies huge systemic problems. And this isn't just theoretical stuff. In that 2003 study we've been talking about, 2 people actually quit halfway through because it was just too distressing. And this quote from another participant just sums up the whole dilemma perfectly. Listen to this. She says she feels it was unethical, but she also thinks the positive outweighs the negative. And yet, she ends by saying she still can't accept it and that there has got to be a better way. That tension is at the very heart of this debate. So, in the end, the blue eyes/brown eyes experiment doesn't give us any easy answers. It just leaves us with this big, lingering question. We all agree empathy is vital, but can you really teach it this way? And if you can, what's the right price to pay for that lesson? And that's where we'll leave it for today. What a fascinating and complicated story, right? It definitely forces us to think. I'm Dr. Peace, and if you want to keep the conversation going, you can find me at Dr. Peace Pod on Instagram and YouTube. Thanks for tuning in.